Okay, thank you very much. I realize it's quite late in the day, so I'm going to give, I hope, a fairly brief presentation. But basically, it's to update you on the considerations that we have that have arisen in the review of the PAS 2050. Oh? No? Yes. For those of you, I'm sure you're all familiar with, but just a little bit of background. The original PAS 2050 was published in October 2008. As Jakob had said, it was the first published methodology for measuring greenhouse gas emissions as defined in the Kyoto Protocol across the life cycle of products. And by products, it included services and goods. It was also accompanied by guidance, which was issued at more or less the same time. The process for a PAS, which is a publicly available specification, imposes a commitment to review within 2 years. And at the time that the review was started, there were over 20,000 downloads in more than 80 countries by the start of the review in autumn 2010. Oops, sorry. So the PAS is actually owned by the British Standards Institution, which is the UK national standards body. There's a very established process for developing a PAS, and that carries through also to the review process. And there are similarities. For example, you have a steering group, you have a review panel, and then you have public consultation. And the overarching thing is that it's transparent and it's consensus-based. I should say a little bit perhaps about the steering group. For the review process, we took a lot of trouble in making sure that there was a good mix and balance of representation in terms of technical expertise and also practical expertise, because we felt both were necessary. At the time the PAS was actually published in 2008, it was already highlighted that certain elements within it weren't quite right. It wasn't perfect. It was deemed to be a first shot, if you like, at pulling all the information that was out there together and coming up with a published standard. But some of the items that were already indicated as being not needing further review at the time of the review were indirect land use change, capital goods, recycling, and carbon storage in soils. Shortly after the PAS was issued, DEFRA established what we called a user trials project. We had 3 products, well, 2 goods, if you like, and a service, all subsumed as products within the standard. We did Johnson & Johnson baby wipes. We did a Dulux paint, which is manufactured by Akzo Nobel. And we did an IT service, which was used actually within DEFRA. So we had goods and services. And this was done, the companies were told, here's PAS 2050, here's the guidance, do the carbon footprint. We had a consultant overseeing it who could come in and explain if there were any uncertainties or they needed guidance. But basically, we wanted them to trial it on their own and then to feed back to us with the results of the trials. So some of the issues that came up in the trials were data. Now, here, Ahmed gave an explanation this morning of some trials he'd done, and as he was presenting, I thought he'd perhaps stolen my slide, because a lot of the issues that he did in Germany actually arose in the UK, which I think is quite an interesting observation. So, for example, the primary data requirement, time-consuming, and if you remember from Ahmed's presentation, that was what came up as well. The difficulties in collecting secondary data, seen as a barrier to take-up. The use phase, there were some difficulties around consumer and post-consumer behavior. Could you use it for comparison? How would you use it for comparison purposes? And also some communication issues. The recommendations from the user trials were that we should be simplifying data prioritization and the materiality assessments. We needed something to amplify what was in the standard itself by way of sector or category group rules or guidance. That there needed to be a focus on practicality to encourage business to do the footprint in the first place, and also to have confidence that others were also measuring in the same way. and also to identify other support. These were ideas that came up. Maybe a library of similar studies or some process mapping tools that would be found as useful. Secondary data. There was a need for a recognized source of full life cycle emission factors for common flows, such as energy, transportation, and waste management. Secondary data sources needed to be accessible as well as available. So it was all very well having stuff out there that was available, but it needed to be accessible as well, so not too complex. And wider publicly available databases, the sources were very difficult to interpret in some cases for non-LCA practitioners. So for example, AkzoNobel actually have a unit that does life cycle assessment all the time. So for them, it wasn't such a problem. But for an SME or a smaller company who don't have a dedicated team doing this sort of work on a regular basis, it might be more complicated. Now, I thought it might just be useful here to say at the time of the review, the feedback we'd had from the user trials, surveys that had been done, and other evidence that we'd gathered in the intervening 2 years, I thought it might be useful to highlight. These were the initial aims when the original PAS was developed. It was in response to a drive from business to understand their product supply chains, to measure their impacts, to manage and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and improve their resource efficiency and reduce risks, and to share information about their work internally with their supply chains and with customers. And our conclusions with all the feedback that we'd had in the intervening time was that actually those aims still remained. So the purpose of the 2010-11 review was to deliver a standard that was updated and improved, easier to use, would increase uptake by business, and would go further towards meeting the original PAS aspirations. So the PAS review, what we took into account were the technical aspects which I've already highlighted, were highlighted in the existing PAS, plus the feedback provided by users and practitioners. And BSI, just prior to the review starting, did a survey of everybody who had actually downloaded the PAS. So there were a lot of people got an email at that time. We also naturally took account of developing international initiatives, and these included obviously the ISO 14067, the GHG Protocol Product Standard, of which you heard about this morning from Holly, and also EU work on PCF harmonization and policy development, and of course the French initiative, which covers multi-criteria, but certainly from the carbon perspective and the approach they were taking, we took that into account as well. The most significant considerations that I can highlight that have arisen during the review was a conclusion from the outset of the review that the revised PAS would need to be underpinned by sector product group requirements. That was a fairly fundamental piece of decision-making, if you like, and so the whole review has been colored by that basic premise. We have used this concept in the review to respond to issues relating to practicality, simplification, and characteristics which are specific to product groups or sectors. And also to address practical aspects, for example, the availability and accessibility of reliable and relevant data. In the course of the review, the main areas of discussion focused on indirect land use change, biogenic carbon, recycling, allocation, the criteria for developing underpinning sector product group requirements, and communication verification. Now, I'm not a practitioner, so I do not intend to go into the technical detail that was involved, and there was a lot of technical detail involved in some of those items, as you can imagine. The final text is in the course of being revised, so I can't say this is what we've definitely decided to do, this is what we haven't decided to do. But suffice to say, for recycling, for example, there will be options within there for applying for different recycling approaches. We also DEFRA decided to have a workshop in March with business and practitioners just to get a feel, if you like, of what their reaction would be to a revised PAS which would be underpinned, which would come out based on the premise that it would be underpinned by sector or product group rules. And I thought I would just share with you, it's a very recent workshop, as you can see. From that workshop, the areas where they thought the rules would be useful would be allocation, system boundaries, such as capital goods, commuting, the use phase, where data was specific to a sector, waste issues, air travel, radiative forcing, and design and R&D. And the last one, for example, I do recall from the evaluation trials that I referred to, the design and R&D phase was very significant for the IT product that was evaluated. The benefits of the supplementary requirements, we felt, would be that there would be a greater scope for use for comparability. It would be more useful on how to actually calculate your footprint. There would be better signposting for data sources, reduced costs for users, and it would improve take-up within sector product group. I should say we'd also approach the review on the understanding that it's all very well having a splendid standard out there, but if nobody's using it, you might as well not have it. We then looked at, within the standard, we felt that if you were going to have rules which amplified, as it were, made the standard more user-friendly within certain product groups or sectors, by the same token, because it was a standard, you needed those supplementary rules, needed themselves to have defined criteria for their development. They needed to meet certain standards, if you like, in themselves. So you couldn't just come up with a set of rules and say, these are supplementary to the PAS 2050. So this, again, is not final form, but these were some of the ideas that were initially put forward for the sort of criteria in order to be in conformity with a revised PAS 2050. These are the sort of broad principles we would be looking for. Very much they would be supplementary to the PAS. They would not be replacing the PAS in any shape or form. What they would be doing, certain elements of the PAS would be supplemented so that they were of more relevance and practical use to a particular sector or product group. The rules would be broadly recognized, and there's been a lot of debate as to what you mean by broadly recognized, and the debate, it will be amplified within the standard, but probably international recognition would be one of them, so that it couldn't just be a small group. They would have to be developed as the PAS and the review has been conducted through a transparent consensus-based approach. They would need to be publicly available. They would need to follow ISO principles where relevant. They would need to be maintained so that they remain current over time. And they would need to be quality assured. The workshop that we had most recently, we put the same question to this group. There were about 25 people at the workshop, all of them from multinationals and practitioners. And these were some additional criteria that they have suggested we need to consider putting into the new PAS standard. The scope of the rules should be very specific. You needed to define very carefully which group those rules applied to. There should perhaps be some guidance in the standard as to how you go about developing them. There needed to be some sensitivity to regional and international factors. So, for example, one of the examples that was given was the infrastructure to recycling, which differs from country to country, perhaps. Needed to build on existing work. There needed to be alignment. And there needed to be an international open source database for these rules. Interestingly enough, we also asked the group, which sectors do you think that these supplementary requirements would be most useful? So having identified which elements of the PAS process they felt would benefit, which sectors? Now, this could, I have to say, be dictated by the people who were at the group, but We have done other work as well, and it's interesting. We've had very similar results. So pharmaceuticals for allocation in particular, that came up. Chemicals, ditto for allocation. Shipping, agriculture, electronics, air transport, packaging, and tourism. And evidence we'd gathered prior to the workshop also indicated that various parts of the metal sector and food and drink generally would also probably benefit from supplementary requirements. The accompanying guidance, we also took a sounding on what they liked about that. The guidance got very high praise in the evaluation tests. Most people used the guidance in preference to the actual standard. They found it more user-friendly. They very much liked the worked examples that are in the current guidance, and it was suggested that further studies to illustrate different aspects of the methodology would be very useful. And our plan is, with the new guidance, that it'll be published about the same time as the new standard itself. A decision was taken at the first steering group meeting of the review panel, of the review, that PAS 2050 would cover quantification only. Measuring carbon footprinting we see very much as a first step in the process. I have, on various occasions, been accused of being anti-communication because of this stance that we take that PAS 2050 is for measuring. We are not. We don't see that. But we do see that there's plenty of stuff already out there relating to communication. Certainly at the European level, you have the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which 27 countries within the EU are expected to transpose into their national legislation, and which goes into great detail as to the sort of elements you need to consider when you're communicating at various levels. However, our team has also been working recently on something we call the Green Claims Guidance. We've had that for some years. We've updated it in line with a recent communication actually issued by the Commission, among other things, which reminded people that the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive also applies to environmental claims. And it's on our website, and I can give it, that's the guidance, and then there's a one-sheet, two-page thing, so I just need to give that little plug. It had a very low-key launch. In fact, it was barely launched. We're cutting back on promotional activities within the department. But it has been extremely well received, and people welcome it. And it's actually been translated into Spanish. We had a request, could they translate it into Spanish? So who knows? And we've had some requests from the United States for it as well. And the aim of this is to actually cover the communications point, which is, how do you make clear, robust claims which can be substantiated? Those are the main points in any communication. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's a communication on a label, it doesn't matter whether you're communicating to your management board, you're wanting them to invest, you've done your life cycle assessment, you've done your carbon footprint, you think you can make you can reduce your carbon footprint, but it needs some investment. You need to make a claim, if you like. Any management board worth their salt was, how do you know that the carbon footprint you've come up with, and so forth. So we need, it's how you make your claims, so clear, robust claims which can be substantiated. And we do see communication and claims as having a very useful role in raising environmental impact awareness for both business and consumers. So we see it really as important. So rather than being anti-communication, we're very pro-communication. But with a big caveat, you need to be careful, you need to be sure that what you're communicating is accurate and can be substantiated and can be justified when challenged. So looking ahead, we see very much a close alignment between the revised PAS 2050 and the GHG Protocol product standard for the quantification of carbon footprinting. We have representatives from the GHG Protocol on our steering group, as we do the ISO committee, the ISO people, and also the Commission. We want close alignment because we see that the idea of having a plethora of standards out there is defeating the object. Too many standards, too much confusion. And one of the benefits, we think, of having a close collaboration and having, if you like, taking a generic approach to carbon footprinting in terms of the quantification, because, of course, the protocol standard is directed more towards reporting, is that any underpinning rules at a product or sector group level should hopefully be equally appropriate for both standards. That's a vision. We'll see how it works out. So the text is in the final stages of refinement. It's due to be published very shortly and with the accompanying guidance. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.